As I mentioned in the last video, I had trouble recording video B, getting audio attached to it, and I think it was because of the length. So I've split up video 5A and B. I didn't rename this one 6 because 6 was already uploaded to YouTube by the time this video was recorded because of the challenges. We're going to talk in this video about housing and how that played into the crisis in the cities, as well as some of the new challenges that we are facing. Housing patterns shape cities, and so if you think about kind of historically, we'll have places like Little Italy or the Upper West Side, and these kinds of distinctions within a city are made on the basis of the type of residents who live there. When poor people are clustered together in a city, challenges can develop in terms of crime and educational offerings and business investment. The federal government historically has a role in causing this discrimination. During the Great Depression, 2 important bills were passed that kind of made cities the economic divide, or created the economic divide within cities. The National Housing Act of 1934 specifically authorized a practice called redlining, which means that realtors are able to collectively develop maps for the city in which they divided up into white areas and non-white areas. And that was specifically authorized in the 1934 legislation. In the 1937 legislation, this created public housing. But the way public housing was developed in terms of tall, densely packed buildings led to a situation where there was a lot of crime in the area, and because the housing projects were in did not disperse affordable housing throughout the city, you ended up creating clusters, which of course then further led to the kind of discrimination that exists in the cities. We mentioned in the first video the role of the GI Bill, so I won't belabor that, but that basically allowed middle-class returning veterans to move out of the city, gutted the cities, and caused problems in that way. Well, after the crisis in the cities and kind of coexisting or co-developing with various civil rights legislation, we start to see the federal government rolling back these policies. This is 30 or 40 years after they're put into place. So the Fair Housing Act of 1968, for instance, specifically outlaws discrimination in terms of housing, and this means that you can't not accept a potential person leasing your home or your apartment if solely on the basis of their race. But it also means that you can't advertise the vacancy with racial or racially coded language. The Fair Housing Policy of 1971 also helped to ensure that the people were protected in terms of the kind of things they were able to rent. The Equal Protection Act of 74, Equal Credit Protection Act, required credit bureaus to judge people's credit in a race-neutral way. The Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1974 required the banks to publish collected statistics on the number of mortgages by racial group, the number of mortgages by interest rates, and how those two items interacted. And then the Community Reinvestment Act of 77 started pumping new money into the cities and tried to turn around a lot of light that had happened during the period where the cities were being out. But these despite the fact that we've had 40 years of more equal housing policy, the patterns that were established in the period between the 30s and the 70s remain. When when racial groups, so first of all, people continue to live in the communities where they grew up, where their parents grew up, and where they have connections to the community. When they when racial groups have dispersed, African Americans and Latinos still reside in racially segregated areas. If you have ever seen the old sitcom The Jeffersons, you know that there was a striving to move up, and that um, is captured on in the lyrics for The Jeffersons, "Moving on up." I won't sing because that would scare you, but the challenges of moving up met one of the challenges to this was that when um, 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 minority groups moved into a neighborhood, the middle class whites moved on to other neighborhoods, and this created much of the same kinds of issues that were present in the areas that the historically underrepresented groups had moved from. And so that challenge is kind of a lingering effect of our long-term housing discrimination policies in the 30s through the 70s. There are some new challenges that go along with this. There has been a lack of investment in cities for a very long time, and this is both public and private investment. The state governments had difficulty investing in cities because of the pushback from the suburbs and the rural areas, as we talked about. The cities had trouble investing because they just didn't have the financial base and resources to do it. Private sector was a lot less likely to invest in high poverty areas, and concentrated their investment in the suburbs and within a city, put their investment resources into wealthier areas of the city. So we have situations develop where we have food ghettos, where there is no access to a grocery store within any kind of commuting distance, walking or other kinds of commuting for people who are in very, very poor areas. Another challenge is gentrification. The idea of gentrification is that a wealthier group will move back into a marginal area, put a lot of investment in it, and between the renovations and the increased demand on a limited supply, the rents go up, which pushes the historic residents out because they can no longer afford the apartments. And so I guess the classic example of this is Williamsburg in New York City, in Brooklyn, where the kind of young hipsters took over what was a historically minority neighborhood, and in doing so, they renovated warehouses, turned them into lofts, built coffee bars and a variety of restaurants and shops that served the new hipster community, and ended up pushing out long-term residents. And so we talk about this in terms of gentrification and how there's almost a reverse racism in not a reverse racism, but there's a kind of racism in moving into historically minority neighborhoods, whites moving into these neighborhoods. There's a couple of TV shows that kind of deal with this. The Neighborhood is, or Welcome to the Neighborhood, is a show about a white family moving into a Black neighborhood in LA. And in that show, it's kind of treated as a comedic thing, and it largely as a good thing. Another show that just developed, or that was just dropped on Netflix, kind of treats this with a little more of a critical eye. I've seen that new show on gentrification on Netflix, so I don't know whether to recommend it or not. But we're starting. What the point is, we're starting to see this in the kind of the larger culture discussions of this, to where there have been two separate TV series approaching the topic. Another issue is how technology has enabled housing discrimination. So in the old system, post 68, realtors were not allowed to use racial language in their advertisements. And because they used mostly newspaper classified advertising, they were they were not able to circumvent these laws because the newspapers in their classified offices enforced the law. They would not allow a an ad for a housing unit that would say whites only or that kind of thing. The new system of advertising has a lot of the small landlords using digital advertising, which has less robust fair housing enforcement. It's not that the laws have gone away, it's that the enforcement mechanisms have. So let's take two examples. When Craigslist developed, it gutted newspapers' revenue. Um, but as jobs and rentals and other things moved to Craigslist and away from their traditional newspaper classifieds, Craigslist has no content moderators that go through every single post to enforce fair housing laws. They will take down posts once they're flagged, but that doesn't preclude those posts from getting out there. And whereas the classifieds editors of old actually looked at every single classified ad. And so what we found is that some of the Craigslist ads have racial or racially coded language. Um, Facebook provides another kind of challenge. So Facebook allows advertisers to target specific demographics. For instance, if you are selling um, sneakers, for instance, your target audience might be kind of a young male audience, and so advertising in that demographic makes sense. Whereas if you're selling makeup, the biggest bang for your buck is probably a young female audience, and so Facebook has an extensive ability to target your audiences, and that's why so many advertisers have become excited about Facebook, is because they can reach the people they most directly want to reach. Well, one of the challenges of this when it comes to enforcing the Fair Housing Act is that one of the demographic categories you can choose is the race of the viewer. And so there were entirely too many landlords advertising vacancies, and in their targeting practices were targeting people on the basis of race. And this was an almost invisible problem because they weren't using racial language. They weren't saying whites only, but when you advertise exclusively to whites, that is a form of discrimination. Facebook has recently banned racial targeting in real estate ads. They've still allowed other kinds of targeting. Some ways this makes sense. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to advertise a home apartment in Anaheim to people in Pittsburgh or Chicago, right? That if the biggest bang for your buck is going to be people in and around Anaheim, and so those kinds of demographic targeting can still be useful, but there are ways of even getting around the racial targeting by putting in specific interests. And so there are some kinds of interests that are just very, very white, things white people do. And if you target the ads in that way, you are likely to exclude most non-white viewers. And so those are the kinds of challenges that technology has put into place. Another challenge is Airbnb and Uber. Airbnb allows landlords to rent out entire apartments or homes to tourists, which effectively takes that housing stock off the market for local residents, which drives up the costs of housing throughout the community. Uber and Lyft pose challenges to public transportation viability, because as people use Uber instead of public transportation, it takes riders off the system, which causes less of an investment in the system, which causes more people to use these alternative transportation systems, and it's a ever downward spiral. So, kind of the challenges of housing are play into the overall challenges of the cities in terms of where people live, what they can afford, and the services that can be provided are all intertwined with historic discrimination patterns in housing.